Greetings. This is I Am Vermont Too, and my name is Sha'an Mouliert. I Am Vermont Too is modeled after the I Too Am Harvard initiative. The I Am Vermont Too photo story project shines a light on the diversity of identities and experiences of people of color all across the state of Vermont. The I Am Vermont Too project is a medium for people of color to tell our stories and convey how racism has a significant impact on our lives. This is the first known statewide multi-generation project done only by people of color working and going to school in the state. It is also a vehicle to outreach for the People of Color Caucus. Social justice activist Grace Lee Boggs said, "Creativity is the key to human liberation." A poem.
I'm me, me be. Goddamn, I am. I can sing and hear me, know me. And that was a part of a song called Undone, the Sweater Song by Weezer.
Thank you. My guest today is Geoffrey Sewake. Welcome to the program. Thank you for being here. Before you tell our viewers about yourself, can you share what it was like to be asked to be on the program today?
Yeah, I think for me, there are a lot of opportunities and challenges to learn more about the experiences of others. Living in a community that doesn't have as much diversity, racially or culturally, I think it's important for people who are willing to share their experience to do so, because it's only by learning and knowing and meeting new people that we get to know each other better and to realize that we're all part of the human experience.
Thank you, and that's a wonderful segue to tell us a little bit about yourself. So how do you identify your background, your family? Where did you come from?
Yeah, so I would identify as Japanese American, multi-generational, hetero cis male. I grew up on the West Coast. I spent my time split between Washington State and California. My parents were divorced amicably, of course, not a tough situation. In the communities I grew up in were more diverse than New England, though I have to say the neighborhoods that I specifically spent my time, where my house was, or the school I went to, were perhaps less diverse than the surrounding West Coast sort of regions, Seattle and Los Angeles being the 2 points where I spent my time. I'm an only child, so that does have an impact on how I grew up. How I made it out here, out to the Northeast, to Vermont, I sort of spent my time, my academic career, moving across the country. Graduated from school on Bainbridge Island in Washington State, and I went to school at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and then moved to Los Angeles for a short period of time after I graduated to be closer to family. And then I ended up going to Vermont Law School in central Vermont, where I got a JD and a master's. And then ended up going to New York City afterwards. I actually graduated into the economic crash, which was, I figured if New York City doesn't have a job for me, then no place probably has a job for me. And that's actually where I met my wife, who's from the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And we decided to move back to Vermont to raise kids with dirt and trees. It's, I'm sure Sha'an can tell you, is difficult to do unless you want to spend all your time at the park, which you do, but it's different. So anyway, and now we live in a town of 700. It's a very loving community. The community has been very welcoming and open to us, sort of embracing our ideas, our thoughts, our leadership, and our participation. So it's been great.
Wonderful. Passions, interests.
Passions, interests, I think that's pretty timely. I currently left my job, my office jockey job, where I was doing community economic development work, sort of facilitating communities' ability to help themselves. The mantra was, you feed someone 2 fish, they can feed themselves for a lifetime. So while we didn't directly do the work such as grant writing and that sort of thing, we helped them help themselves and figure out how to do it by facilitating community conversations to gathering that data needed to have those conversations so that we're not just coming up with facts off of our mind, whatever we believe or felt, but more what is actually true, what we see on boots on the ground. So back to my point of the passion, my passion is in food and drink. And so I'm actually opening a very small brewery, not that we don't have enough breweries in Vermont and in the area already, but my passion is in food and drink. And so I'm opening a small brewery in downtown St. Johnsbury. Our focus will be on small plates and foods locally sourced and that sort of thing, and beer that speaks to the place and to myself. So that's what I got.
And you're a part of the rejuvenation of St. Johnsbury, and as Railroad Street, I see, has more offerings for people that you are a part of that, and it's so welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So, what has or has there been an impact for you around racism living in Vermont?
Yeah, I think the way I would go back to growing up as a person of color. And this is something that, as I talk to other people of Asian descent, is a common, something that seems to be something that many of them experience, not to speak to all, but to many. And that's the perception from others who are not Asian that we're not from here. That the question is, so where are you from? And I say, well, I was born in Los Angeles. And then the follow-up question can be, no, before that. And so the assumption that we're not from here. So it sort of stems from an ignorance or a misunderstanding or just not being familiar with people of Asian descent. That the assumption is if you don't look like you're from here, you're not white, that you must be from someplace else. You must be an immigrant. One question I think is kind of funny that I've been asked before is, do you speak Chinese? So assuming that I'm Chinese, but I also find a little bit of that a little funny because there isn't just one spoken language in China, and so asking me if I speak Chinese is kind of silly in and of itself. And so I feel, to bring it back to Vermont, I feel much of the interactions of racism for me that I've felt personally has been through that ignorance of understanding of where I might be from and that the assumption that I'm not from here. I often talk about when I was working, doing community economic development work and talking about being a welcoming community, I've often talked about how it's important that we don't assume where people are from, and that while there's a tradition in New England to ground yourself to what are your connections to this place, because people, and rightly so, care and cherish their family roots and the place that they live and how beautiful and wonderful the culture is here. It puts people who are not necessarily from here or born here at a disadvantage or in an unfair place, especially for people whose background, such as Asians, may feel like you're asking whether they're immigrants, or the assumption is that they're an immigrant. And so when I've introduced myself, I often start with, I'm Jeff, my father-in-law works at the academy, my mother-in-law, does theater, and so grounding myself to the place, and in the back of my mind, trying to prove that I belong here. And what's interesting is I was at a community conversation, and I started with that, and someone rightly and pointedly said, Jeff, you don't need to prove why you should be here and what your roots are. We want you here, and we all need to get over that proving that you belong, because we want people to be here, because you sort of bring that, you do bring that diversity, that rich culture from wherever you're from, new, young, old. And I think that's important.
I agree. And one of the ways I say how we experience microaggressions is how we perpetuate Vermont being one of the whitest states. I will speak to my experience and as well as other folks of color. So it's not only an Asian experience, that for folks of color and some who are Abenaki, that people in that you're not from here don't recognize how they are holding up the whiteness of Vermont. And again, whether it's out of ignorance, and for people of color, for them to also recognize, oh, yeah, this is what it looks like. So on the subject of microaggressions, is there a particular incident you would like to share and how you felt at that time?
Yeah, I think for me, in Vermont, if I speak just to Vermont, the biggest microaggression that has sort of a long standing, I know, in other people's lives who are people of color, but also not people of color, but is the Confederate flag. Mm-hmm. It's something that as I grew up, I was told to avoid places that had the Confederate flag, or that I should be cautious. And it's sort of a red flag, so to speak, to not interact. And so moving here, far away from the South, in a place that touts itself as a welcoming place, that we freed the slaves, and this, that, and the other thing, that I would see the sign of the Confederacy, a sign that is just riddled with so much terribleness and awfulness within the space that I live, is scary and frightening, and takes me aback. And I think it's so interesting how often you hear people talk about, well, it's just a flag, but it comes with a lot of imagery and hate. So it's designed through that social space that's built around it, is designed to create that fear that I shouldn't be here, and if you are here, you should leave, or you should feel unwelcome. And it's been nice as of late. I've seen fewer of them, but the ones that continue to perpetuate the space, especially the public space, feels even worse, because it's even more intentional in its messaging, so to speak.
So in that space, scary as you had mentioned, what do you need? What would you need?
I would like more conversation. I think we all need to speak, and I think this is a great venue for letting people know that we're all human. You open with a poem, The Humanities, what it is to be human. We share this, and that our differences make us better. That's the beauty of being in this country. I mean, we're one of the most diverse places in the world as a nation. And so capitalizing on that asset and building on it. I did a TED Talk in Littleton, and the topic that I spoke on was about being welcoming. What can we do to welcome newcomers into our communities, or make people who live here who don't feel welcome feel more welcome? And I think New England has sort of the grounding that it needs, right? People smile, they're friendly, and often they come out with a handshake when they meet you. And I think that's the greatest first step, an honest handshake and a friendly smile. And that's sort of that starting point, you know. It starts with welcoming, but it builds from there, those conversations that you have with your neighbor, with your then to become friend or colleague, which then shows the humanity of people, that we all come from different places, and that by learning from other people, we can be better.
One of the delights I experienced when I first moved up from New York City to the Northeast Kingdom, that driving, people would wave to you. Walking along Main Street in Newport, people would nod, look at you. Coming from New York City, where direct eye contact was a form of aggression, that it was, again, a delight. And I can remember my son, who grew up in Vermont, you know, as a young person, would see me waving, and do you know that person? No. But each time you waved, there was a validation of our humanities. And I think that's one of the reasons around living here in Vermont, that there, and in the Northeast Kingdom, when it could be a bit harsh, and yet the neighbors have been there for me. I've seen them being there for others. And even around that, so we talk about being welcoming. What barriers, if any, have you put up because of microaggressions?
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you bring that up. Barriers are something that I feel like I've almost been programmed to have, based on what I look like, or where my ancestry comes from, even though I've had the same sort of upbringing and experiences the rest of my classmates. And that's to assume that people don't feel I belong. And that's a barrier, that's sort of a layer I've put on, which I've more recently started to try to break down, which is thankfully from my last job, where I really spoke about being welcome. It's helped me to dissect how I feel about that and how others might meet my needs or others, in terms of breaking that the not belonging feeling. And also when I go in, this is something I think other people of color feel, is when I go into a store, my assumption is that the salesperson thinks I don't belong there and is watching me. I remember throughout my entire life, when I would go into a store, the sales rep would watch me the whole time and assume that I don't belong there. And more recently, actually, when I was in another state, not in Vermont, I had that exact experience where I went in, I was picking something up for my wife. I was well-dressed, well-attired. I came in well-spoken, speaking to I assume was probably the owner. It was a very small shop. And while she had helped this other woman and was super nice and super kind, she immediately put on this sort of character of me not belonging, and why was I in there, and what do I want? Like, why would you be here? And I was literally just asking to pick something up that we had asked them to order. And it's a very unwelcoming feeling. And those are the reasons why I have those layers, because, you know, when you interact with those folks who feel like we don't belong, it makes it difficult to build the assumption that you do. When it could be 99.99% of your interactions are positive. When you encounter that one, it brings you right back to the beginning, and you start putting up those layers again. I had an interaction in this community as well where I was walking down the street. I was just shopping, and a truck full of young men drove by, and they yelled, "Go back to China, you fucking chink." And then they threw their drinks at me. And that was it was almost disbelief that people would do something like that in this community. And I had such high aspirations for this community. And, you know, people do these acts to create a sense of fear. And they were very successful. I don't want to go to this community often. And I had that community in the highest regard. And it's really hard to dig themselves out of that. But yes, so barriers. That's why I have barriers, because I feel like I don't belong. And interactions like that really push me right back to the start of overcoming those.
Oh, I am sorry that you experienced that. I'm sorry for that community that holds that space that happens. It's common, and the reason why I put up that's a question around barriers, around safety. It's hard to feel welcomed if you don't feel safe. Maslow hierarchy of needs. Your primary safety isn't taken care of, nothing else is going to happen. And for many of us, speaking for myself, that in order for us to be ourselves, that we need to be around ourselves. That we have recognized that we can't fully express in our communities because, just as you said, that one person can say something and the floor has been dropped, and no matter 99 other people have said something, it's that one person. And we've got enough empirical data to say that's how human nature works. And moving forward to that, what do you think if you were to, make a proposal to the community? What would you say that would make the lives better? People of color more visible, our experiences validated, and our contributions to the community valued.
I think one step in this conversation is to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's that initial discomfort of meeting and getting to know someone of color that will really, in my opinion, catapult us to a community, a society where we do understand each other, and it's not built on this hate that has no scientific or good reason why we have this hate. Within this community, I think what can help, and I'm speaking to St. Johnsbury, and I think we're making those efforts, is we have business owners who come from a variety of different backgrounds, and welcoming them, which we are, and giving space to people of color who wish to speak about their experience. and allowing those who are not people of color to put themselves in those shoes and feel okay with having that uncomfortable conversation so that they can get beyond that discomfort. I think that was a really hard conversation for me. I was at my previous job, and we ourselves were going through diversity and inclusion and being a welcoming place. I don't know if folks remember, but several years ago there were some pretty serious events that took place across the river. There was a young boy who was almost hung by two older boys. And in Durham, New Hampshire, there were kids saying really horrible, racially charged name-calling to a kid in elementary school on the way back. And I found it it came with a positive and a negative. One was Vermont, the secretary or whoever it was in charge in Vermont wrote an open letter condemning it. But in the state of New Hampshire, it took time after they had condemned it for them to respond in a public way, condemning the terribleness and the inappropriateness of all of this and how to respond to it. So within my own organization, we were dealing with that. And it was difficult for me because I'm a person of color, and as you know, there aren't very many people of color. So it only seems appropriate that I would, rightly or wrongly, unknowingly or not, be tokenized as the person who might have all the answers. And so, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think by having these conversations, being uncomfortable, we can get beyond that. Let's find the token person to solve all of our questions, because only by understanding all of our experiences, by reaching out and getting to know people, can we really come to a full understanding.
Exactly. Building a foundational understanding, which we don't have. We use words, even the word race. People don't have a unified, universal understanding, and yet they're working on it. You are visible in our community. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience. It's a wide range. And as someone who's lived in the St. Johnsbury area for almost 12 years, this is the first time I've experienced, especially in hospitality, people of color applauding your commitment to the community by setting down roots, by being in an industry that is about welcoming, is about bringing people together. And I thank you for that. I also thank you for being my guest on the program, for providing the poem, and for our viewers, thank you for watching, and like us on Facebook.